23 musicians from 9 different countries playing banned American jazz, 8 days after their concentration camp was liberated. If you think you know the story of World War II, you don't know this. In the next 30 minutes, I'm taking you inside one of history's most extraordinary stories of human resilience. You'll discover how jazz orchestras formed in Nazi death camps, how German prisoners of war in Texas built full theaters with 15-piece orchestras, and how music became the ultimate weapon of cultural resistance. You'll hear about the Ghetto Swingers who played Gershwin under SS surveillance, the secret jazz sessions in Buchenwald that kept humanity alive, and the bizarre reality of German POWs studying American democracy by day and performing Beethoven by night. This isn't just history. It's a masterclass in how creativity survives when everything else is stripped away. Before we dive in, if you're fascinated by untold stories from World War II, hit that like button right now. It helps YouTube show this to more history enthusiasts who need to hear it. All right, let's start with a scene that sounds impossible. Picture this. It's 1944, inside the Theresienstadt ghetto in occupied Czechoslovakia. The SS has just set up cameras and lights in a wooden pavilion. They're filming a propaganda movie to show the Red Cross that Jewish prisoners are being treated well. And onto this makeshift stage walks a jazz band called the Ghetto Swingers. The trumpeter, Erich Vogel, counts them in. 1, 2, 3, 4, and they launch into Gershwin's I Got Rhythm, full swing arrangement, American jazz, the music the Nazis had officially banned as degenerate. And yet here they are, playing it under direct SS orders. Now here's what makes this absolutely insane. These weren't amateurs. Erich Vogel was a professional Czech trumpeter. Martin Roman, the pianist, had played in German clubs before the war. They had arrangements of Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Glenn Miller, Cole Porter. They'd memorized Tin Pan Alley standards, and they were performing them in a concentration camp that would eventually send 50,000 people to their deaths. But here's the thing that nobody tells you about camp music. It wasn't just propaganda. It wasn't just coercion. Yes, the SS exploited these performances. Yes, prisoners were often forced to play. But something else was happening too, something the guards didn't understand and couldn't control. The music was survival. It was resistance. It was a lifeline that connected these prisoners to the outside world, to their identities, to their humanity. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how that worked, because the story gets even stranger. See, the Nazis had this bizarre relationship with music. On one hand, they banned jazz, called it degenerate art, entarteti music. Too American, too black, too free. But on the other hand, they needed music in the camps. They needed it for psychological control. Prisoners had to march to music, had to sing while working. The SS created official camp orchestras specifically for roll call and forced labor. So you had this twisted system where music was both a tool of oppression and a space of possibility. And prisoners figured out how to exploit that gap. They figured out how to turn the SS's own requirements into opportunities for cultural resistance. Let me give you a specific example. In Buchenwald concentration camp, starting in 1938, there was an official camp band. They played marches, military music, exactly what the SS wanted. But then a Czech political prisoner named Vlastimil Lauda got put in charge of expanding it, and Lauda was smart. He turned it into what he called the International Camp Band. He recruited musicians from every nationality in the camp: Germans, Czechs, Poles, French, Russians. Eventually, it grew from 32 members to about 120 performers. And yes, they still played the marches for roll call. But Lauda also arranged secret concerts, classical music, string quartets. He smuggled in check sheet music. He got a guy named Morris Hewitt to lead a string quartet that played pieces by Debussy and Ravel. And then there was Jeezy Jacques, Czech journalist, jazz enthusiast, and one of the most interesting characters in this whole story. Jacques organized completely clandestine jazz sessions in Buchenwald, underground concerts where prisoners played swing and Latin tunes. These performances weren't authorized. If they got caught, there would be consequences. But Jacques understood something crucial. He understood that jazz, specifically, represented freedom, improvisation, individuality, everything the concentration camp system tried to destroy. Years later, Jacques described these secret jazz sessions as an oasis of humanity. He said they connected prisoners to the outside world, reminded them that creativity still existed, that they were still human beings capable of making art. Now, drop a comment below if you're already seeing how wild this gets. I read every single one, and I want to know what aspect of this story hits you hardest. So here's where it gets even more fascinating. Jacques didn't just organize secret jam sessions. He helped create a full jazz orchestra in Buchenwald called Rhythmus, R-H-Y-T-H-M-U-S. And recent research from 2023 has uncovered the details of this ensemble, details that were basically unknown for decades. Rhythmus was founded in 1943. It eventually had 23 musicians from 9 different countries. Think about what that means. You've got a German saxophonist, a Czech pianist, a Polish drummer, a French trumpeter, all imprisoned together, all forming a swing orchestra in a Nazi concentration camp. They played arrangements of Duke Ellington, Lionel Hampton, Cole Porter, Fats Waller, Glenn Miller, Louis Armstrong, all the giants of American jazz. And we know they gave at least 2 documented performances, one in November 1944, when the camp was still fully operational, and then another one on April 19, 1945. 8 days after American troops liberated Buchenwald. 8 days after liberation, these guys are back on stage playing the same band jazz they'd been secretly performing for 2 years. In 2022, a music school in Weimar, Germany, worked with the Buchenwald Memorial to recreate one of those original Rhythmus programs. They used the archived set lists, tracked down the arrangements, and performed it as a commemoration. And when you listen to those recordings or read the accounts, you realize something profound. This wasn't just entertainment. This was cultural warfare. Every time these musicians played a Duke Ellington tune, they were asserting that the SS couldn't control their minds. They were saying, "You can imprison our bodies, but you can't kill our culture. You can ban this music, but we'll play it anyway. And we'll play it together, across nationalities, across languages, because music is bigger than your ideology." Now let me shift gears, because the story of concentration camp music is only half the picture. At the exact same time this is happening in Europe, there's a parallel universe unfolding in the United States. And it's almost the mirror image. Starting in 1943, the U.S. starts housing German prisoners of war on American soil. By the end of the war, there are over 400,000 German POWs in camps across the United States. And the War Department makes a deliberate decision. They're going to treat these prisoners well, not just because of the Geneva Convention, but because they want to ensure American POWs in Germany get reciprocal treatment, and because they have this idea that they can use cultural programs to win hearts and minds, to introduce these Germans to American democracy. So they create educational and recreational programs. And one of the most elaborate examples was Camp Hearn in Texas and Camp Algona in Iowa. These camps had 15-piece orchestras staffed entirely by German POWs. They built full theaters with orchestra pits, stadium seating, professional lighting. Prisoners formed drama clubs, opera companies, choral groups. They staged productions with full sets and costumes. And here's the kicker. The YMCA provided instruments, sheet music, educational materials. The prisoners could take university correspondence courses, mathematics, English, agriculture, American government. Some guys studied American democracy in the morning and then played Beethoven in the evening. Now, if this is already changing how you think about World War II, hit that subscribe button. I release new history deep dives every Tuesday, and next week I'm uncovering the secret collaboration between Allied intelligence and Nazi scientists that nobody talks about. So Camp Hearn in Texas was nicknamed Fritz Ritz by locals because the conditions were so good. Each compound had its own theater. The prisoners built these themselves, by the way. They constructed stages, sewed costumes, painted scenery, and they performed for each other, for the guards, and sometimes for local Americans. There's this incredible story about Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's captured military orchestra. These guys ended up at Camp Hearn, and on July 4th, 1944, the American camp commander wanted them to perform for Independence Day. He set up this whole celebration, put an American flag behind the stage as a backdrop. And the orchestra refused to play. They said, "We're not performing under the American flag. It's a matter of national pride." So what does the commander do? He takes down the flag. He removes it, and then the orchestra plays. And you have to sit with the absurdity of that moment. German POWs negotiating the terms of their performance, American officers accommodating them, all while their countrymen are fighting and dying in Europe. But here's what's important to understand. These programs weren't just about music. They were about cultural exchange and soft power. American officials believed that if they exposed German prisoners to American culture, to democratic ideals, to educational opportunities, some of them might go back to Germany after the war as advocates for democracy. And the music programs were central to that strategy. When German POWs played American jazz alongside Brahms and Wagner, when they performed for mixed audiences of prisoners and locals, when they taught each other instruments and formed multinational ensembles, they were participating in a form of cultural diplomacy. One prisoner at Camp Algona in Iowa, a violinist named Friedrich Bialas, bought a violin after he arrived at the camp and joined the orchestra. On the ship crossing the Atlantic, he and other musicians organized shows that even the Allied guards paid to attend. Think about that. Enemy soldiers entertaining their captors, music creating a temporary truce. Now, I want to be really clear about something, because it's easy to romanticize these stories. It's easy to say, oh, music brought people together. Music transcended war. Music was this beautiful force for good. And there's truth in that. But we also have to acknowledge the darkness, because not all camp music was voluntary. Not all of it was uplifting. Some of it was psychological torture. The most horrific example is the Janowska concentration camp orchestra in occupied Poland. The SS forced prisoners to form a band they nicknamed the Tango of Death. And the guards would make this orchestra play a tango while they executed other inmates. They'd line people up, shoot them, and the whole time this tango is playing in the background. Eventually, the musicians themselves were executed. So, when we talk about music in camps, we have to hold this tension. Music was coerced, and it was voluntary. It was propaganda, and it was resistance. It was a tool of oppression and a lifeline of hope. It all existed at the same time, often in the same spaces. The Ghetto Swingers in Theresienstadt, for example, were filmed for Nazi propaganda. That 1944 movie I mentioned earlier was designed to deceive the Red Cross, to show that Jews were being treated humanely. And the band knew that. They knew they were being used, But they also knew that playing music gave them purpose, gave them community, gave them a reason to survive another day. So they did it anyway. And here's where it gets philosophically complex. Can you call it resistance if you're being coerced? Can you call it art if it's serving propaganda? The historians who study this stuff have debated it for decades, and the answer seems to be yes, it's both. Human beings are capable of holding contradictions. You can be forced to perform and still pour genuine emotion into the music. You can serve someone else's agenda and simultaneously subvert it. Guido Fackler, one of the leading historians of concentration camp music, argues that camp music functioned on three levels: forced entertainment for the SS, propaganda to deceive outsiders, and clandestine cultural expression used by prisoners to maintain hope and identity. All three could happen with the same orchestra, sometimes on the same day. We're at the halfway point now, and you've already learned about the Ghetto Swingers, the Rhythmus Orchestra in Buchenwald, and the Fritz Ritz theaters in American POW camps, but here's where it gets even deeper, because I haven't told you about the educational dimension yet. And this is where the story becomes a case study in cultural diplomacy. See, the American POW camps weren't just providing entertainment. They were running full educational programs. The YMCA and the War Department believed that education could be a form of ideological conversion. If they could teach German POWs about democracy, about American values, about freedom of speech and pluralism, maybe those prisoners would go back to Germany after the war and help rebuild it as a democratic society. So, at Camp Hearn, hundreds of POWs took university correspondence courses. They studied mathematics, English, agriculture, American government. They read translated versions of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. They had access to libraries. And, crucially, they had access to music and art programs that emphasized individual expression and cultural diversity. The music programs, specifically, became a way to model democratic values. In the orchestras and bands, prisoners from different regions of Germany, different social classes, different political backgrounds had to collaborate. They had to negotiate, they had to make collective decisions about repertoire, about performance schedules, about how to balance German classical music with American jazz and popular songs, and there's evidence that it worked, at least for some prisoners. Oral histories from former POWs describe how exposure to American culture, including music, shifted their perspectives. One former prisoner said that hearing American jazz for the first time made him realize that the Nazi propaganda about degenerate art was nonsense. He said the music was sophisticated, emotionally rich, technically demanding. It wasn't degenerate, it was beautiful. Another prisoner talked about how the educational programs challenged his assumptions about democracy. He'd been taught that democracy was weak, chaotic, inefficient, but the camp programs showed him that democracy could produce art, could foster education, could create opportunities for personal growth. He went back to Germany after the war and became a teacher, specifically because of what he learned at Camp Hearn. Now, if you're finding this valuable, I've linked some resources in the description, including articles about the Ghetto Swingers, the Rhythmus Orchestra, and the educational programs at Camp Hearn. Check them out after this video. So let's talk about the repertoire, because that's where you really see the cultural bridge building in action. In the concentration camps, orchestras played a mix of European classical music and American jazz. The Ghetto Swingers in Theresienstadt played Gershwin's I Got Rhythm, but they also played Czech folk songs and German cabaret tunes. The Rhythmus Orchestra in Buchenwald played Duke Ellington and Glenn Miller, but they also performed compositions by European composers. And in the American POW camps, German orchestras played Beethoven and Brahms. but they also learned American standards. They played Irving Berlin, George Gershwin, Cole Porter. They performed operas by Wagner, but also Broadway musicals. This wasn't just cultural exchange. This was cultural fusion. It was proving that music from different traditions could coexist, could complement each other, could create something new. There's a musicologist named Anne Dijkstra who studies this stuff, and she makes a fascinating point. She says that when the Ghetto Swingers played American swing in Theresienstadt, they were engaging in cultural resistance. They were saying, you can't control what we listen to, what we play, what we love. But they were also engaging in cultural preservation. By playing Czech folk songs alongside Gershwin, they were asserting their identity, their heritage, their refusal to be erased. And you see the same dynamic in the POW camps. When German prisoners played American jazz, they were participating in cultural exchange, opening themselves to new influences. But when they also played Brahms and Schubert, they were preserving their own musical heritage, reminding themselves and their captors that German culture wasn't reducible to Nazism. This is what music does, right? It holds complexity. It resists binary thinking. It says, I can love this and that. I can be this and that. I can honor my tradition while embracing yours. And in the context of war, in the context of camps designed to dehumanize people, that ability to hold complexity was radical. Now, let's talk about some of the individuals, because the statistics are one thing, but the personal stories are what make this real. Let's start with Jiří Žák, the Czech journalist I mentioned earlier. Žák was imprisoned in Buchenwald in 1943. He was a jazz enthusiast before the war, played in Prague clubs, knew all the American standards, and when he got to Buchenwald, he immediately started looking for other musicians. He found them: Germans, French, Poles, other Czechs. And he organized these secret jazz sessions. They'd meet in corners of the barracks, in basements, anywhere they could avoid the guards. They'd play swing tunes, Latin numbers, improvised jams. And Jacques later wrote that these sessions were like a separate world. He said, for an hour, we weren't prisoners. We were musicians. We were free. After the war, Jacques performed for Allied troops. He went on to have a career as a journalist and musician. But he never stopped talking about Buchenwald. He gave lectures, wrote memoirs, did interviews. He wanted people to understand that the music wasn't just a sidelight, wasn't just a footnote. It was central to survival. It was how you stayed human when everything was trying to strip that away. Then there's Erich Vogel, the Czech trumpeter who formed the Ghetto Swingers in Theresienstadt. Vogel was a professional musician before the war. He'd played in swing bands, knew the American repertoire inside out, and when he got to Theresienstadt in 1942, he saw an opportunity. The SS had set up this free time organization, this propaganda apparatus, to make the camp look humane. And Vogel thought, if they're going to exploit us anyway, why not use it to play the music we love? So he recruited the best musicians in the camp: Martin Roman on piano, other guys on sax, drums, bass. And they formed this ensemble modeled on American swing bands. They called themselves the Ghetto Swingers, a deliberate reference to groups like Benny Goodman's orchestra. And they played every chance they got: coffee houses, theaters, the wooden pavilion the SS built for propaganda. And yes, they were filmed for that 1944 propaganda movie. Yes, the SS used them, but Vogel later said that every time they played, they were reclaiming something. They were saying, this music is ours. You can film us, but you can't own us. The act of playing jazz, specifically jazz, was an assertion of freedom. Vogel survived Theresienstadt. He went on to perform professionally after the war, and like Jacques, He spent the rest of his life talking about the power of music in the camps. Now, know someone who's into World War II history or music history? Share this video with them. Seriously, this is the kind of story that doesn't get told enough, and it needs to reach more people. All right, now let's talk about some of the advanced dynamics here, because there's a layer to this story that most people miss, and it has to do with the SS's own contradictions. The Nazis banned jazz. Officially, it was degenerate music, entartete music, too black, too American, too improvisational, too free. But in practice, they allowed it in certain camps. Why? Because they needed it for propaganda. They needed it to show the Red Cross and other international observers that prisoners were being treated well. So you had this bizarre situation where the same regime that was murdering millions of people was also permitting jazz performances in concentration camps. And the prisoners understood this contradiction. They understood that the SS's ideological rigidity created gaps, spaces where music could flourish even when it was officially forbidden. This is what scholars call the paradox of Nazi cultural policy. On one hand, extreme censorship and control. On the other hand, pragmatic allowances when it served the regime's interests. And prisoners exploited those allowances. They turned propaganda opportunities into genuine cultural experiences. They used the SS's own rules against them, and here's where it connects to the POW camps in America. The U.S. War Department had a different motivation for allowing music programs. They wanted to demonstrate that democracy was superior to fascism. They wanted to show that democratic societies valued art, education, individual expression. So they provided resources, instruments, sheet music, educational materials, and they encouraged German prisoners to engage with American culture. But here's the twist. The German prisoners often resisted full assimilation. They'd play American jazz, sure, but they'd also insist on playing German classical music. They'd study American democracy, but they'd also organize lectures on German philosophy and literature. They were engaging in cultural exchange on their own terms, not just passive recipients of American propaganda. And that's what makes this story so rich. Both sides, the Nazis and the Americans, tried to use music for their own purposes: propaganda, control, ideological conversion. But the musicians themselves, whether in concentration camps or POW camps, asserted their own agency. They played what they wanted to play. They found meaning in the music that transcended whatever political use it was being put to. There's a philosopher named Theodor Adorno who wrote about music and fascism, and he argued that music always exceeds its political context. Even when it's being used for propaganda, even when it's coerced, the music itself retains an autonomy, a capacity to communicate things the authorities didn't intend. And that's exactly what happened in these camps. The music communicated solidarity, resilience, hope, humanity. Things the SS didn't want, things the War Department couldn't fully control. Let's talk about the legacy, because this story doesn't end in 1945. It's ongoing. In 2022, a music school in Weimar worked with the Buchenwald Memorial to recreate one of the original Rhythmus jazz orchestra programs. They tracked down the set lists, found arrangements of Duke Ellington and Cole Porter tunes, and performed them as a commemoration. The concert was sold out. People came from all over Europe to hear this music played again 80 years later. In 2025, there was a lecture at a synagogue in Vermont called The Music of Terezin, focusing on the Ghetto Swingers and conductor Raphael Schechter, who led inmates in major works like Verdi's Requiem. These events show that there's still intense interest in camp music, still a need to understand how art functioned under oppression, and museums are getting involved too. The Camp Hearn Museum in Texas has a full exhibit on the POW orchestras, complete with instruments, sheet music, photographs. The Camp Algona POW Museum in Iowa has similar exhibits. These museums are preserving artifacts, conducting oral histories, making sure this part of history doesn't get forgotten. There are also books being published. Guido Fackler's Music in Concentration Camps, 1933 to 1945, came out in English translation in 2021. Coco Schumann's memoir, The Ghetto Swinger, was reprinted in 2019. These resources are making the history accessible to new audiences, and there are documentaries, online exhibits, academic conferences. The Oral Foundation has a whole section on music and the Holocaust. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has audio clips of camp songs, interviews with survivors, digitized sheet music. All of this is available online, free to access. So why does this matter now, 80 years later? Because we're still grappling with the same questions. How does art survive under oppression? Can music be a form of resistance? What's the relationship between culture and politics? How do we preserve humanity in dehumanizing circumstances? These aren't just historical questions. They're relevant today. Think about musicians in authoritarian regimes, artists in conflict zones, cultural workers in refugee camps. The same dynamics are playing out. Music as survival, music as resistance, music as a bridge across divides. And there's another reason this matters. We're living in a time of intense polarization, of cultural and political division. And this story shows that even in the most extreme circumstances, even between enemies, music can create moments of connection. It can remind people of their shared humanity. It can build bridges when everything else is tearing them down. The German POWs who studied American democracy and played jazz at Camp Hearn went back to Germany after the war. Some of them became advocates for democratic reform. Some of them maintained friendships with their American guards. Music and education didn't erase the war, didn't make up for the atrocities. But they planted seeds. They showed that cultural exchange is possible even between adversaries. And the survivors of concentration camps, the guys like Jerzy Jacques and Eric Vogel, they spent the rest of their lives talking about music. Not just about the horror, though that was real, but about the music, about how it kept them alive, gave them purpose, connected them to something bigger than the camp. Let's do a quick recap, because we've covered a lot. You now know about the Ghetto Swingers in Theresienstadt, a jazz band that played American swing under SS surveillance. You know about the Rhythmus Orchestra in Buchenwald, 23 musicians from 9 countries playing band jazz. You know about Camp Hearn and Camp Algona, where German POWs built full theaters and studied American democracy. You know about the tension between coercion and voluntary expression, propaganda and resistance. And you know why this story still matters today, 80 years later. Here's what I want you to do. Take one insight from this video, just one, and think about how it applies to the present. Maybe it's the idea that art survives even under extreme oppression. Maybe it's the power of cultural exchange to shift perspectives. Maybe it's the complexity of human experience, the way people can hold contradictions, can be victims and artists at the same time. Whatever resonates with you, sit with it. And then come back and let me know in the comments. And if you want to go even deeper into untold World War II stories, click that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. In my next video, I'm uncovering the secret network of women who ran intelligence operations across occupied Europe, stories that were classified for 60 years and are just now coming to light. You won't want to miss it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about these stories, and I'll see you in the next one.